Hello everyone. I would like to introduce you to my grandmother, Miss Linda Walden. She is going to be talking about the 1960s. So, how old were you during the 1960s?
Okay, I was a young teenager starting out the decade, so for most of my teenage years were in the 60s, early adulthood.
Okay. Where did you live during the 60s?
Well, I was born in the city of Baltimore, but when I was just a toddler, my parents moved to the suburbs of Baltimore in a community called Sunset Beach. So it was, well, it was more rural than it is today, but it was like a shore community. Lots of fishing, boating, skiing, that kind of thing, not far from the water. So it was a great place to live and grow up.
What are some of the most memorable events to you that happened to the nation during the 1960s?
Okay, well, my parents were very much interested in politics, and that was before the days of cable news, 24/7 news coverage, but they were always watching the news, reading, so they were very interested in the politics. And I began the decade around the time of the election of President Kennedy. So of course, you know, that was a huge event starting out the decade, and so probably the biggest thing that had such an impact on our lives would naturally be when he was assassinated. And I was in high school. I remember the day that it happened because the principal came onto the loudspeaker and he first said something like, "Well, I have an announcement to make. All the school activities will be canceled. We won't have school on Monday. Want you to go to your lockers and get your things and then just quietly go out the door." And then he said that the president had been shot and he was killed. And so of course we were very stunned over that news. It was a very, very solemn day that day in high school. And then when I returned home, of course my parents were really, you know, just so sad that everything had happened. And even in those days on a black and white television, they had 24-hour pretty much coverage of all the events that took place, and the coming from Dallas to back to Washington, D.C., and then all the events of the weekend and the funeral and everything. And we were just absolutely glued to the television from morning to night. So that really impacted everyone. We were all really pretty much in shock that that could happen to a president of our country. So that was a big thing, I think, and to watch it, everything. I don't remember where I was when Martin Luther King was shot. I just knew it happened, and I remember feeling like, how could that happen to that man who had so many children, and now they were without a father, and of course another Kennedy had been assassinated. And for Martin Luther King, you know, I don't remember a lot of racial unrest, probably because in our community we did not have a lot of black families living there, and we weren't that far from Baltimore. And I know there was some unrest, and I think there were curfews, and you know, I never realized how bad it probably was in the city of Baltimore until we had the recent riots in Baltimore. And they referred back to the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King, comparing the two. So it must have been pretty bad, but I was kind of distant from that. I was in school, and you know, so, but I mean, you know, it just seemed like the nation had such insecurity. You know, first of all, you know, the assassinations. Another thing was we were in the middle of the Cold War with Russia, And I remember as a child, of course now from an adult perspective, I know it really wouldn't have helped us any, but we had drills, air raid drills, where we would have to either get under our desk or go out into the hallway and put our arms over our heads to protect our heads. But of course, living close to DC and Baltimore, and we of course were in the age of nuclear bombs, that, you know, that really wouldn't have done much. But I mean, it created a climate of fear. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, we really did come to the brink of war at that point in time. And that was the time when people were building bomb shelters and trying to have supplies for survival in case of war. And we didn't have a bomb shelter, and as I thought, I need to do something to protect my family, so I stored up bottled water and powdered milk in the basement, and of course the mice got to the powdered milk, so, but I mean, that would have done nothing. But that was the climate of fear that people lived in. And I remember I only lived 2 blocks from the fire department, and the people were volunteers, the men were volunteers. So whenever there was an emergency of any kind, they would sound the sirens and all the volunteers would get there as closely as they could. But we noticed that they were testing a different siren that lasted longer, and we really felt like that might have been the air raid warning. And I just remember one night that went off, and it just kept going and going, and I just woke up and I went to my parents' room, and all I said was, the siren. And we all just stood there. That was the first time I really had seen fear in my parents' faces, that they really were concerned that this really could be war. So it is so good that the decade ended in the man on the moon.
Going back to Martin Luther King just for a second, how would you describe the mood of the nation after he was assassinated?
Well, I think it was really shocking, again, that he had been assassinated. I kind of was distant from that, actually. I mean, I really can't say, there was not anything that I knew of in the area where I lived. And like I said, there were a lot of things going on in the cities. And I know that parents didn't want their young adult or older teenagers out because they were afraid that something could happen. But it was just, again, shock. Like, how could that happen, you know, that he had been shot. So, I mean, I can't say too much more about that. It just, I remember thinking, it's so shocking, and all of it just gives you a sense that, wow, anything could happen, where you felt, you know, that you just never would have expected the leaders that you looked up to and admired would be taken out by some assassin. So, I guess that's all I could say about that.
During the 1960s, segregation and racism were a big part of that, with the civil rights movement and everything. What are some of your experiences or things that you saw about that correlate to that?
Well, like I said, the communities I lived in, it just was not a good racial balance then. Of course it is now. And I really didn't even know of any kids that were black children that went to like the middle school until I got there. But I don't recall anything that there was a problem with them not fitting in or us accepting. I mean, you know, they were involved in activities just like we were, and we were friends with them. And I know it was bad in other places, but not where I lived that I know. Now, it might have been in the cities more so because the population demographics were different in the city. But, you know, I can't really say that it was a huge problem or anything, or saw that people were mistreated because of racial ethnicity or anything like that. So I know it went on, but I didn't see it.
Did you ever see any of it on the news or anything on the TV or radio?
Oh, well, when I watched the news with my parents, which I wasn't into news like they were, and probably more so what was going on in the cities. And it just was a period of turmoil and unrest, and then with the Vietnam War, and there were demonstrations against the war that people really had problems with that, and I remember seeing some of that. But I was at a different phase of life as the decade continued, as I, trained and went to school for medical technology and that kind of thing. So I didn't spend a whole time like a lot of time like I do now. But I knew that there was a lot of unrest and demonstrations for different things, including, racial demonstrations and demonstrations about the war. So, anyway.
Did you have anyone in your family that was involved in the Vietnam War?
No, I had a brother who was younger than I who could have been drafted. I think the draft was still going on then. Of course, later in the early 70s, I was married, and my husband was in the Navy during the Vietnam War when things were really getting hot. That was kind of went into the 70s. But that was during the time of the draft, because he received his draft number while he was working on his master's degree in college, and there were no exemptions at that time, or at least there wouldn't have been for him. So he decided to enlist in the Navy and was accepted into the nuclear submarine program. So there was the draft going on at that time. And it was hard. I have a very close friend who lost her brother. He was killed in the Vietnam War. And then when my husband went out on submarines, they were always having drills as if there were conflict because of Vietnam. And he said there was one time in particular he felt for sure it wasn't a drill, that it was a real thing. Things were really heating up over in Vietnam. So, yeah, for young men during that time, I mean, they could have been drafted. I mean, some, I suppose, could do other things, possibly be exempt. But for the most part, their lives could have been interrupted at that point because they had to go serve their country. And so it's different now with the totally volunteer military that we have today. Thinking about the racial thing, not so much in what I experienced, but I do remember one time my father told me my parents had lived in the South, and then they moved up to Baltimore up north. But I remember him telling me one time that in those days, if there were two men walking on a sidewalk, one was black and one was white, it was just expected that when they came to a point, one of them would have to step off the sidewalk to let the other pass. And I mean, it was just totally expected that the black person would step aside for the white person. And I do remember my father just lamenting over the injustice of that kind of thing. But we didn't see it in our communities. But anyway.
Moving away from a lot of the death and stuff that was in the 60s, the moon landing. What was the mood of the nation? What was that like for you when we finally got Americans into space and on the moon?
That was really, I think, the highlight of the decade, for sure. Because we had been through so much. Russia started out ahead in the space race. And then, of course, one of Kennedy's goals was to excel and surpass the Russians in the space race. So, and because no one had ever gone to the moon before, I mean, we were all excited, and we got to see a lot of, on a black and white TV, or at least that's all we had, of the separation of the spacecraft and when they would actually take the module and land on the moon. But people didn't know what that was going to be like. And so we were excited, but it was like, whoo, a really tense moment, because you were just praying that all would go well and they would land. I thought it was interesting that even Neil Armstrong himself, when he got to the point where he was going to be the first man to come down that ladder and step on the moon, he had a concern because of the theory of evolution, that the whole universe is much older than a lot of creationists believe that it is. And there was a possibility, because of the billions and millions of years, supposed years, that when he stepped onto the moon, that he could have sunk down in, all this dust, like be sucked up in all the dust. But of course they found out there was very little, which would give support to a younger universe theory than, the billions of years theory. But when we were all I was at a friend's house, and we were all just gathered around that set, and to actually watch him come down and take that step on the moon, it was just exhilarating. And it was like, from a decade of turmoil, and then to have that triumphant event that happened, we all were just, first of all, so thankful to the Lord that they were safe, and then also celebrated for the triumph of our country, of that achievement. I mean, who would have ever thought that we could have accomplished that? So it was a wonderful, proud moment in all the hearts of Americans, I think, and for people all around the world who were friends of America celebrated with us in that event. It was great.
Well, I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for letting me interview
welcome.
you. And thank you everyone for watching.
Magic cow, Papa, magic cow, Papa, I'm a magic cow, Papa, I'm magic